Hello and welcome to this video on making a bonsai in a rock. This is a style of bonsai effectively similar to growing root over rock, the distinguishing feature largely being that it's more reminiscent of a mountain or a very barren landscape, and in fact in some cases that's more or less what you're trying to achieve. It's like a bonsai or a real natural tree in the environment clinging onto the side of a cliff or similar, barely holding in there, but surviving nevertheless. And it can be very simple or very complicated, and so we'll show you a few different ways to do it, with two major approaches, a shaft straight down, and a way to make a sort of crater or recess. In a manner of speaking, similar to what you see in the left here, and in the top right corner. Importantly, remember, you want to be using something like volcanic rock as they're lightweight and easy to work, and you'll see why we suggest that as we go through this video. The other advantage to doing it this way is, well, they're generally readily available. So as you can see here, we have our nice bit of volcanic rock. Now, this was already somewhat broken up, which was easier for us to then use because we're now going to reassemble it. And by assembling our own, we can make it as and how we want. And in this case it'll be somewhat more decorative. Now you can choose to do it this way, or you can simply choose to make a whole volcanic rock and simply find a large existing specimen that suits your needs. But this approach works too, and it's one way to make effectively a rock planting that's to exactly what you want and need. And that means you can have one large planting like this, which is similar to a pot, or something more complicated with more smaller planting locations, similar to a mountainside. So first of all, as you can see, we dry fit all the parts to ensure it all goes together and that we're reasonably satisfied. It's important to note that there's a space in the middle where the glue that we use, the silicone type glue, will not go. This will allow for drainage. Normally we wouldn't use a white type glue, as you can see here. The reason we're using it is because it makes it obvious and visible for you to watch in the video, and we'll be able to paint it over later. It's not a great solution, but for the purposes of making it visible, it's much better. Now, it's also important to note that we are using a silicone-based glue. The reason for that is very simple. The water that will flow through this will eventually wear out and break down the rock, and if it doesn't break down the rock, it'll wear out and remove any glue that's typical. For example, a PVA type glue, such as a craft glue. And because of this, silicone is desirable. The other reason is that because it compresses into the pores of the volcanic rock, it has a somewhat better adhesion factor. So we apply 2 lumps or 2 bits of glue to each side of this. These will be squished in as we crush it all together. Now, because we can also use the silicone glue as a filler, if there's any issues around it not quite adhering the way we want, well, we can come back later on and apply more. There's no real issue, but it's really quite simple. Having dry fitted it all, and then start applying your glue after you take it apart, but try and take it apart in a way that you can reasonably easily reassemble it the way you want. As we found going through this, the major elements weren't too hard. In fact, they're actually quite easy. It was the smaller rocks that we were having trouble with later on, and you'll see that as we go through. Some of these parts, as also when we glue it, just weren't quite satisfying. They looked okay in the first place, but when we come back to it, they're just not right, which is another reason to consider silicone glue. It does give you a little bit of working time. Admittedly, not as much as something like PVA or a construction glue or even a wood glue for that matter, but it also has a somewhat better adhesion in the end, and particularly those waterproof properties that we need. The other reason we're using volcanic rock, and this is an important caveat to most of this, is how lightweight it is. If we were to be blunt about this, larger plantings, and particularly larger plantings like this, are very uncomfortable and difficult to handle if we're talking about this in context of, well, just being a massive rock basically. And that's the problem. If you use volcanic rock, however, you mitigate a lot of those challenges. And it's quite simple. The volcanic rock is basically a sponge. The majority of its content is actually air, with very little rock, so to say. with so much air making up the majority of it, it's actually much easier and much more comfortable to handle because it is relatively lightweight. Understand the word relative is important here. You can instead choose to use other rocks that are not so porous, but to be blunt about it, you're probably going to regret that decision. They'll be very difficult to handle, they'll be very heavy, and ultimately it's a lot more effort than it's worth in some respects. Again, we'll get to an exception to that towards later in the video. Now, as you can see, we're slowly going through and gluing this together. Now, the easiest solution is, as you can see, to go through and apply your glue, and then you smear it and push it into any gaps to make sure you fill them completely, apart from that drainage spot. Now, if you were inclined, you could also add a wire to this and glue in the wire at the same time to tie down the bonsai in here. Now, it's not necessary, of course, but it may be something you wish to consider, particularly if this is going to be an irregularly shaped pot. Now, this is not so much irregularly shaped, it's still fairly typical, and that is it's mostly a similar shape to a bowl. But if you're not going to go with this sort of design and instead use something more atypical, you should probably consider inclusion of wires to tie down. The other thing to consider, and particularly as you'll see here, the use of a clear silicone-based glue is better. Now, as we mentioned, we're using a white glue to make it obvious what we're doing, but if you're going to use this for any kind of exhibition or similar, something like a clear glue, or if you want a black glue, is probably better, and that's because it won't be so visible or obvious. Now, it's your choice again, you can choose to ignore that and go with whatever works. After all, it's very much going to be a case of what color rock you have and how obvious the gaps are. In this instance, some of them are much more obvious than the other, because we have used it to fill some of the wider areas, and where some of the rock just does not want to stick, such as that one in the back corner, that refuses to play ball. On top of the issues around the type of glue, the color of the glue, and the nature of the rock, remember you want to include some degree of drainage. Now, if instead of being able to assemble your rock planting like we are here, you instead have to rely on what's mostly already existing, you can consider using your drill and drilling some holes to assist with drainage. It's just as viable and in some cases necessary, as we'll get to later in the video, but otherwise it's a perfectly viable way to go about this, is simply to have one large hole like you would the bonsai pot, and that's basically what we've done. The other consideration is whether or not you want to use something like hot glue. Now, this can be useful if you want to hold your planting in place before it's all set and the silicone glue has dried or cured. Of course, again, not necessary, but if you do use hot glue, something like isopropyl alcohol will help to get rid of that glue. Now, as you can see here, to quote from Shrek, we have a nice rock. It's a very nice rock, but it's also a very hard rock. And this is an example where you really do want to consider something like volcanic rock as an option, because you need to use ceramic drill bits like this. But even those ceramic drill bits are an absolute nightmare with this, because this is very hard material. In fact, it appears to be fundamentally the same sort of material as you would use for castle walls. The other important element here is to make sure you use your hearing and eye protection, but if you're going to do this, there are two approaches you can take with this sort of rock, largely because it's very hard and very difficult to work with. But there's also technically a third option, which is the juncture between the two options we'll describe, and you can apply the basic ideas from either in other more creative ways. The first is simply to drill a shaft straight down into the rock, and this is very much like mining, remembering you need your ceramic drill bit for this. Now, it works brilliantly for small plants. Think of very small plants, like ferns, tiny little junipers, for example, azaleas, something that doesn't require a great deal of space. But, at the other hand, it's also not going to fit anything larger. Now, if you're going to go bigger, this will not work. The other thing to be mindful of, and this is going to be unfortunate for most people, If you want to do this, the power tools you'll need won't be necessarily the conveniently available hand drill. You're going to need something bigger and more powerful. Now, you could theoretically, with something like volcanic rock, get away with a hand drill. It would work fine. And in the end, yes, you will get there. It will just take a very long time. In the end, we switched over to something more significant to get these holes. The first hole we drilled was just one small shaft straight down, and this would work just fine if we wanted a small planting on top of the rock. But if we want something more than that, whether it's a larger planting, a larger plant, or anything else, we now need to drill multiple holes down. These holes can now be dealt with several ways. You can go with the tried and traditional method of a chisel, and fundamentally chisel it out, using those holes as a sort of barriers that would prevent any cracking from spreading beyond where you want it to be. Now, it's not necessarily a perfect approach, and in fact, arguably, it's not going to work at all. Your other option is to use something like a miniature jackhammer, or possibly a Dremel tool, but if it's volcanic rock, you can probably get away with a chisel. And by doing this, you can chisel out what is similar to a concave or a crater, basically, and that allows you to plant into this. Now, the planting as it is not going to be perfect. As you'll notice, we've lost several of the parts of this rock. Large sections have chipped off and we can reattach those, but others are simply gone, and they will remain gone, unfortunately. But ultimately, it hasn't overly affected the condition of the rock itself. It's still structurally sound, and we have plenty of space to plant within. So ultimately, this hasn't been a net loss, it's just taken a fair bit of time and effort. And certainly by comparison to other rocks we could have used, like the volcanic rock, it's not a great outcome, not for the amount of time and effort put into it. But if you find an especially nice rock, yes, it can be a very good option, because you might not be able to get what you want. For example, if it's a much more decorative stone, or in some cases if it's a stone that you simply can't get in a smaller size. For example, something marble-like, or granite, slate, or whatever else. Ultimately, the process is reasonably straightforward and simple, and you can get good results. It's just a differing degree of effort depending on what you want to achieve. Some are very simple, some need to be customized, and some need the power tools. But ultimately, it's still a good outcome. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.